In this introduction to controls within AppForms video, we're going to take a look at the table view and the data table controls. So I've already got a form that I've created that's opened in the designer, and I've added a data table control as well as a few table view controls. So I'd initially like to start with the data table control, and we'll take a look at the properties available to it and how you might use it. So I'll select the data table control. Again, it's residing within this hidden controls section, which if it's collapsed will be here at the bottom of the AppForms designer, and you just click the up arrow and that will expand it. So select the data table control, and there's only a couple of properties. There's a control name property, which just allows you to specify a unique name for the control, and it has a data source property, and the data source property allows you to specify the data source type, which can be either SQL, stored procedure, web service, a RESTful service, or you can populate it with static data if you'd like. And so what we'll do is I'll go through and we'll walk through the configuration of all of these different data source types, and just to show you what that looks like. So let's start with SQL, and then once you select the type, if you click the little gear icon, this will bring up the data table configuration wizard. This gives a listing of all of the data source objects that I have available. So I'm going to select for this example the Northwind table that I have. I'll pick the categories table, and then we'll select the columns from the table to load into the data table object. If you want to specify criteria, you can do so here. I'm going to pass on that for now. If you had selected multiple tables, then you can use this relation page to define a relationship between the two tables. But again, I only selected one, so I'll skip that. And then this brings us to our configuration screen where we have our column layout, we have the column IDs, we have a column header which you can change if you'd like, the type of control you'd like to use or specify for that column, so it can be any of these items in this list. You can also specify the width and also reorder the columns if needed. And you also have the option to hide and sort them as well. So I'm going to just leave it the way it is right now. I'll select the option to have it load the data into the control form load, and then we'll click finish. So that's effectively configured the data table. Now it is a hidden control, so there's no real UI from the perspective of if I load the form, we're not going to see the data in the data table per se. But there is a function that we can call, and I'll just quickly add a button here and set the rule for it. You can use the show data table and specify the data table name, which in this case is just data table 1. And this will allow us to see the data and verify that the data has been loaded in the control. So let's preview the form. Now I'll click the button and it should load. It loads a web page, and this shows the values that were loaded into the data table control, so we can verify that there were records that were loaded. Now there is one other thing you can do with the data table control, and that is you can take a table view control if you have one or if you'd like to use one, and if you set the is lightweight property to true for the control, there is a function that you can call bind to table view, and you can specify the source table or the source data table that you want to use and the table view control that you want to bind that data to. And if we preview the form, so we've loaded the data into the data table. If I click the bind table view, I can now bind this table view control to that data from the data table object, and it's displayed within the table view control. So that concludes the properties and how to configure the data source settings for the data table control. Now we'll take a look at the table view. So basically the table view is a control that will give you a read-only view of the data. It's similar, as you may have noticed, to the data table, but this is an actual visible control that you can lay out and display on the form. So it gives you a read-only view of the data in a tabular type format. You can specify the column headers and you get rows of data returned. The table view control has got a number of properties associated with it. And so what we'll do is take a look at those properties and try to define what each of those does. And in doing so, we may have to toggle between preview mode and back quite a bit to kind of see what all these are. But let's just start out again. Control name is the first property, and again, that's just the standard unique name for the control. There's an enable select property. If this is checked, what this will do is when the table view is displayed, there'll be a checkbox displayed that allow you to select the various rows in the table view that you'd like to select. So let me just demonstrate this. And I will go ahead and also, while I'm doing that, cover the search on load property. What this does, if this is checked, then this will automatically populate the table view control once the form loads. So I'll need that selected in order to demonstrate the enable select. So we'll just take a quick look at both of these. Okay, so notice the table view loaded with some data from the Northwind database. This is customers table. The enable select property is what has turned on this column of checkboxes along each row, and notice that I can select multiple rows, or if I want to select all, I can simply do that. But it allows you the ability to go through and check and select whatever rows you want to select from the control. Note that if I disable the search on load checkbox, since I don't have a rule populating it, notice now the control does not load with any data. Is lightweight. I mentioned this previously. In order to do the binding, this needs to be checked. But this also, if it is checked, will disable some of the advanced functionalities of the table view control, a couple of which are, if this is checked, you're missing the option to be able to turn off the paging option for the table view control with this checked. Also, there are some grouping and row detail properties that are disabled that can't be set with that property check. So let me demonstrate what I mean. Notice with this unchecked, there's a remove paging option. This will allow you to turn paging off for the control if you want to do that. And as mentioned, the expand grouping and row details are now available with the is lightweight option or property being disabled. Sorry, let me reload the data by checking the search on load, and now we'll take a look at the paging property and what it does. So notice by default the page size is 6, so I'll get 6 records displayed, and then you can page, by paging you can click this button to page between the other pages of data in the control. So if you don't want to have the paging controls on the bottom there, if you check the remove paging property, notice now you get the data in the control with a scroll bar that will allow you to scroll all the way through without any of the paging controls down here at the bottom. So that's what remove paging does. Page size, that controls how many records are going to be displayed per page. So again, by default, there was 6. If I change this to 10 and preview it with paging turned on, Notice you get a scroll bar to scroll through the other rows until you get to the bottom of the 10th row, and then you can page through to the next 10 and the next 10, etc. Export, you have an option to export the data from the table view. By default, it's set to none, but you can export to a CSV, XLS, XLSX, or OXLS format. So if you want the option to export, just pick the format you want. And then with the XLSX, you get another export mode where you can choose default or format it. I'll just leave it with default. Excel name is going to be export test. This is just going to be the name of the file that's created. If you preview, notice now you have this Excel icon that's to the lower right of the grid. If you click this, it will actually export and generate the file in your Downloads folder with the name you specified and the date appended to it. If you open the file in Excel, you should see the exported data. And let me make this more visible. So here's the data that's exported to the Excel file. That covers those properties. Trigger on all rows. If this is checked, the rule that you specified for the table view will get executed for each row that's loaded into the table view. There's a show header. If this is checked, then the header is displayed, the column header display is displayed in the control. Show header is first row. If that's checked, our first row kind of now becomes our column header. Wrap text, if this is checked, this allows text wrapping or for the columns. So let me see if we can demonstrate this. Okay, so we do have a couple of columns, or at least this column where the data is kind of being truncated. We enable text wrapping, and so now notice that rather than just truncating the text, it wraps. And then you have kind of a scroll bar to be able to scroll and see the entire contents of that column. So trigger on link button clicked. This will force the rule to be executed if you have a link button defined within your table view, within a column within your table view. Then when you click that link button, that will cause the rule to execute. And there's also a trigger on paging that if this is checked, then the rule gets executed as you click the paging buttons at the bottom there to page between pages of records. You have a max row height setting that controls the max row height. By default, it's 25. You can change that to make that larger or smaller as desired. You have a remarks property, which is just like a comment property that you can specify for the control that's available in the AppForms designer view only. Allow clear. If this checkbox is checked, this will allow you to clear the contents of the table view control using the clear function. So let me demonstrate that. Notice we have data populated. I have a button here that calls the clear function, passing it this table view control. So notice clicking it causes the table view to clear. If I uncheck this allow clear option, now when I click clear, it doesn't do anything. Enable search. This allows the table view to be populated with the fill data function. So if this is unchecked, then really what it essentially does is disable the table view as the data is not populated. There's a dynamic height property. If this is checked, then the control will automatically resize to fit the contents of the control. And you can also set the max height to prevent it from growing to an exceedingly large value in the event that there are a number of records, and maybe the paging option is disabled. So you can then also set the max height for it as well. Expand grouping property. If this is checked, then what this will do is if you have grouping enabled within the table view, this will automatically expand that grouping. So let me demonstrate how you might utilize that. So let me tweak the configuration for a moment. So I'm going to select order details. Hopefully this will work. Pick the fields. Okay, so I can, in the configuration, if I go to the Advanced tab, we didn't really look at that before. So here's, again, our column of our column definitions and with the types and widths, etc. If I go to Advanced, I can do a grouping, and let's say I want to group by product ID. So if I add that, let's view the... Okay, so notice now I have the items grouped by product ID, and you can notice there's 3 items under this one. So if you expand and you see those, 2 items under this particular product ID. So now if I turn the expand grouping on, or sorry, if I check the expand grouping property and preview the form now, notice it automatically expands the grouped items for you. Row details, you can either have those turned off, and they are by default, or you can set it to on select, always, or collapse. So on select, if I preview, when I click a row, I'll get in this case it's a blank, but I get a row details row that's expanded there. So that's kind of how you can, gives you control over what the details, how that functions. It can always be turned on or it can be collapsed. So by default it's none. Oh, there was a property I missed. If it's on always, you can check this. There's an include blank row property that will add you a blank row to it as well. The no result message, this is basically just a message that's displayed if there's no data returned. So I'll just type no data found. Let me modify the criteria. Let's say we're order ID 0. I think that should return 0 records. So now it displays no data found. And lastly, we have the border property, and this is the border lines within the interior of the table view control. By default, the value is set to default, and that will give you both the horizontal and the vertical lines. You can change that to either horizontal, giving you only the horizontal lines, vertical, giving you only the vertical lines, or none. So let me demonstrate. I'll select none, preview. Notice we have no vertical lines. The horizontal lines are a little bit more difficult to see that they're not there with the alternate background, but there are no lines displayed within the inside of the table view. So let me switch it to vertical. Now you see we do definitely have the vertical lines between the columns. If I go back to default, we have the vertical, and there are, again, it's difficult to denote with the alternate background, but there are horizontal as well as vertical lines in the table view control. Style properties, there are very similar style properties as we've previously covered for some of the other standard controls, so don't really want to focus so much on those, but there are row and header height properties that are unique to the table view, so this will allow you to customize the row height and header height for the control. There's also an alternative background color, so right now it's a very light gray. Let me see if I can give it a slightly blue tint so that you can see the difference. So notice for the alternate rows now we have a blue color instead of the gray, so you can customize that alternate row color. I think really the only other piece to cover are the data source properties. Actually, before I do that, let me go ahead and set a rule so that I can cover a couple of those trigger properties that we looked at. I'm not going to do the trigger on all rows because it's going to fire too much, but so here's the trigger on paging. So let me preview. So in the initial page load, so we get the hello message. And now when I click to page to the next page, I get the rule fire again when I click back to go to the previous page. So that's the trigger on paging. There's also a trigger on button link click, and in order to demonstrate that, let me show you another option that you have with the table view control. So in this case, I've got a customer ID field. So what I want to do is, rather than show the data, which is by default what it's doing, I want to change this to a link button. And so you have an option for an image or an icon if you want to use that. I'm going to select an image and just utilize some of the built-in images that are available. I'll just select the pencil image. And what I want this to do, and you don't have to pick the image if you don't want to, but what I want this to do is when I click on the ID, I want to go and load another form that's going to load, and what I want to do is pass it the customer ID that we're clicking on. So this sets the TXT cust ID field that's on my form that I'm going to load, this edit customer form, to the value that we currently are clicking on. So I do that, click add, and now I have this set up. So this is going to allow us to demo a couple of things, but one is going to be the link button, which is what we've got the trigger on link button clicked. So I'll be able to demonstrate that and then show you how you can utilize the link button to provide ways to be able to edit the data that you see within the table view control. So let me go ahead and check this in. I want to grab the form URL. Okay, so we get our hello message again because the table view control got populated there. So notice now that my customer ID, I have a little pencil icon associated with each one of the records. So if I click this record for Alfred's, notice that here we've triggered the rule from the link button click. So what this has now done is it's opened up this other form, and I've got a data source set up for the form so that whenever the customer ID field gets populated, it will go and select the data for that record. So what I can do from within this form now is if I want to, let's say there's no region specified. So I'm just going to type in some characters here for the region. And now I have an update command that's set to allow me to update the data for the record. So that should update Alfred's record with this AG value for the region. And now when I close this, I've got a hidden control that gets updated by that close, which triggers that control to be updated and then closes that form. And by triggering that hidden field, it forces a refresh of the data in the table view. And so notice now you see my updated Alfred's record. So that's something that you might utilize the link button click for whenever you're dealing with a table view control, so that you can see the records. Now, I know you can't directly edit them, but again, you could pretty easily navigate to another form like we did in this case, edit the record, and then have that updated data be displayed in the control. So hopefully that covers both of those. The last thing we really want to look at with the table view are the data source options. So again, for this particular table view, we've looked at the SQL server. So let's configure this second one. And while we've been using SQL Server for the first table view, I'd like to again use it for the second table view so that we can walk through the configuration wizard completely. So if we select the table view, in the property pane, if you go look under the data source property, once the data source type is set to SQL Server or MS SQL, if you click on the gear icon, this will load the table view items, and this is basically the wizard that you'll use to configure the data source for the table view control. So in this case, I'll select the Northwind sample database and click Next. I'm going to select the orders table and click Next. Here I'll pick a few fields to display within the table view and then click Next. On this page, if you want to specify a criteria, you can drop down the select, pick the field that you want to use for the criteria, set the equal or whatever comparison operator you want to select. Then here you can specify either a field on the form or a hard-coded value. If you want to add more than one, you can click the plus and then it'll just keep adding the additional criteria. But in this case, I don't want to particularly add criteria, so I'll click Next. Here, if we had selected multiple tables, you can specify and set up the relationship for those. But again, I'll just click Next. And this brings us to our listing of fields that we've selected. Here you have the option of customizing the column header. Here you can specify the data type for the column. You can adjust the width as needed. So I'll adjust these first two columns because they're containing smaller amounts of data. I'll set the width to 50. If you need to reorder the columns, you can do so here by modifying the order. If you want to hide a column or columns, you can do so by checking or unchecking the hide property, and also the sorting. I'll check this option to use the form load as my trigger so that the data for the control gets loaded when the form loads. And then I'll click Finish. Now let's preview the form. Notice that we have our data loaded from the orders table. Also note that the column widths for the first two columns are a bit smaller than the other columns, so it's picked up our column settings. And you can page through and see the other data as needed. So that's basically all that's required to configure the table view control to retrieve data from a SQL Server table. I hope that you found this video beneficial. Please view our other AppForms training videos for more in-depth tutorials regarding AppForms, as well as our how-to videos that show you how to implement various tasks within your AppForms solutions. Thank you.